February 19, 1945 dawned gray and ominous over the black volcanic beaches of Iwo Jima. As Marine Private First Class, Robert Henderson crouched behind a Sherman tank, watching something that would haunt his dreams forever. The massive steel beast before him wasn't ordinary. This was a Zippo, a flamethrower tank that could project streams of napalm over 400 feet into the honeycomb of caves that riddled Mount Suribachi like a termite-infested log. The morning air suddenly erupted in a thunderous roar as the Zippo's main gun fired, followed immediately by a jet of orange-white flame that seemed to stretch toward the cave openings like the finger of an angry god. Henderson had seen combat before, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of liquid fire cascading across the volcanic rock, illuminating the darkness within the Japanese fortifications with hellish light. Inside Cave System Able 7, Japanese Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamamoto pressed his back against the cool volcanic stone, his hands trembling as he clutched his Arisaka rifle. The 24-year-old officer from Osaka had been prepared to die for the Emperor, but the sound approaching from outside de-EF'd every tactical manual he had studied. It wasn't the familiar whistle of artillery shells or the staccato rhythm of machine gun fire. It was something primal, like the breath of a dragon from ancient folklore. The first tongues of flame licked at the cave entrance, and Yamamoto felt the temperature spike dramatically. The napalm mixture, consisting of gasoline thickened with polystyrene, created a viscous liquid that stuck to surfaces and burned at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Within seconds, the carefully constructed defensive positions near the cave mouth became an inferno that consumed oxygen faster than human lungs could process it. Behind the American lines, Technical Sergeant Michael O'Brien watched through his field glasses as his Zippo tank, officially designed Edzone. O'Brien had been instrumental in adapting the Canadian Ronson flamethrower system to the Sherman chassis, creating what soldiers had nicknamed Zippo tanks after the popular cigarette lighter. Tee-hee irony wasn't lost on him that a device meant to create small flames for tobacco had lent its name to this mechanical apocalypse. The tank crew inside worked with mechanical precision despite the psychological weight of their weapon. Tank Commander Staff Sergeant James Mitchell called out targets through the intercom while Air Corporal David Kim adjusted the flame projector's elevation. The system could carry 750 gallons of napalm mixture, enough for 80 shots that could each reach distances previously thought impossible for portable flame weapons. According to military records preserved in the National Archives, the psychological impact of these flame attacks often proved more decisive than their physical destruction. Japanese soldiers, renowned for their willingness to fight to the death, began abandoning positions that had been considered impregnable just days earlier. As the morning progressed, the pattern repeated across dozens of cave systems. The Zippo tanks would position themselves at maximum effective range, unleash their streams of liquid fire, and watch as positions that had withstood conventional bombardment for weeks suddenly fell silent. The weapon represented a new chapter in the brutal calculus of Pacific warfare, where every yard of volcanic rock had been purchased with blood and determination. The stage was set for a confrontation that would redefine how both sides understood the nature of courage, survival, and the terrible mathematics of modern warfare in the most unforgiving theater of the Second World War. January 8, 1944, 11 months before the Iwo Jima assault, Colonel Andrew Jackson sat in a cramped office at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, studying blueprints that would fundamentally change Pacific combat operations. The challenge before his engineering team seemed almost impossible. How do you mount a weapon capable of projecting flame 400 feet from a tank chassis without incinerating the crew inside? The Canadian Ronson system had shown promise, but adapting it to American Sherman tanks required solving problems that pushed the boundaries of 1940s engineering. The flame mixture had to maintain its consistency over extreme distances. The pressure system needed to function reliably in tropical humidity, and the entire apparatus had to fit within the confines of a tank turret without compromising mobility or protection. Captain William Torres, the project's chief engineer, had spent sleepless nights calculating pressure ratios and fuel mixture compositions. The breakthrough came when his team discovered that adding polystyrene to gasoline created a substance that behaved like liquid fire, sticky enough to adhere to targets, viscous enough to project over vast distances, and hot enough to make cave systems uninhabitable within seconds. Meanwhile, in the caves of Iwo Jima, Japanese engineers were creating their own deadly innovations. Major Kunio Nakagawa supervised the construction of an underground fortress system that had taken 8 months to complete. The volcanic rock of the island provided natural protection, but his engineers had enhanced it with reinforced concrete, steel plating salvaged from ships, and ventilation systems designed to keep defenders alive through prolonged bombardments. Nakagawa's defensive philosophy centered on depth and interconnection. Rather than relying on beach fortifications that could be neutralized by naval gunfire, he had created a network of caves, tunnels, and bunkers that extended deep into Mount Suribachi's volcanic core. Each position was designed to support others through overlapping fields of fire, and elaborate tunnel systems allowed troops to reinforce threatened positions without exposing themselves to American artillery. The Japanese had studied American tactical manuals captured in previous campaigns and understood that conventional weapons would be used against their positions. They had prepared for high explosive shells, armor-piercing rounds, and even poison gas attacks. However, their defensive preparations had not anticipated weapons that could literally fill enclosed spaces with liquid fire that consumed oxygen and created temperatures exceeding those found in steel foundries. As production of the Zippo tanks accelerated through the summer of 1944, American training programs struggled to prepare crews for the psychological challenges of their weapon. Unlike conventional tank gunnery, which required precision aiming at specific targets, flamethrower operations involved painting entire areas with streams of burning liquid. The weapon's effectiveness came not from surgical strikes, but from creating zones of absolute destruction that made enemy positions uninhabitable. Training exercises at Fort Knox revealed unexpected challenges. Crews discovered that operating flamethrower tanks required different tactical thinking than conventional armor operations. The weapons were most effective when used against fixed positions where defenders had limited mobility, but they were vulnerable to counterattack due to the time required to deploy and aim the flame projectors. The psychological preparation proved equally complex. Military psychiatrists noted that crews operating flame weapons experienced different stress patterns than those using conventional armament. The visual impact of their weapon, the sight of liquid fire streaming across battlefield dios, and the knowledge of what it meant for enemy personnel, created unique psychological burdens that required specialized counseling approaches. As 1944 drew to a close, the first operational Zippo tanks were loaded aboard transport ships bound for the Pacific Theater. The crews who accompanied them represented a new breed of warrior, equipped with weapons that would transform the brutal cave fighting that characterized island warfare into something approaching industrial-scale devastation. The engineering challenges had been solved, the training completed, and the weapons deployed. All that remained was to test their effectiveness against an enemy that had never encountered anything like the mechanical dragons that were about to be unleashed against their volcanic fortress. November 22, 1944, 3 months before the American invasion, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi walked through the tunnels of Iwo Jima with the methodical pace of a man inspecting his own tomb. The 53-year-old commander had spent years in the United States before the war, serving as a military attaché and developing a deep understanding of American industrial capacity and tactical capabilities. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he harbored no illusions about Japan's ability to win the war. His mission was simply to make the Americans pay such a terrible price that they might reconsider their demands for unconditional surrender. The island beneath his feet represented the culmination of Japanese defensive engineering. Over 21,000 troops had spent months transforming Iwo Jima into a fortress that existed primarily in deer ground. The volcanic rock provided natural protection, but Kuribayashi's engineers had enhanced it with concrete reinforcements, steel plating, and ventilation systems that could sustain defenders through extended sieges. Captain Takechi Nishi, commanding the 26th Tank Regiment, supervised the installation of artillery pieces in caves that had been carved specifically to house them. The famous Olympic equestrian champion had adapted his knowledge of terrain and movement to create firing position, that could engage American landing forces while remaining virtually invisible to naval bombardment. His tanks, dug into prepared positions with only their guns exposed, represented a new approach to armored warfare that prioritized survival over mobility. The cave systems extended in 3 dimensions throughout Mount Suribachi and the island's central highlands. Engineers had created multiple levels connected by narrow tunnels that could be sealed in sections if one area became compromised. Fresh water came from underground springs, ammunicio, and was stored in blast-resistant chambers, and medical facilities were established in the deepest caves where wounded soldiers could receive treatment away from the bombardment that would inevitably precede any American assault. Sergeant Major Yuki Tanaka supervised the stockpiling of supplies that would sustain the garrison through what everyone understood would be a prolonged battle. Rice, pickled vegetables, and dried fish-filled chambers that had been carved from solid rock. Ammunition for rifles, machine guns, and artillery pieces was distributed throughout the tunnel systems to ensure that no single hit could eliminate the garrison's ability to fight. The psychological preparation proved as important as the physical fortifications. Kuribayashi issued orders that differed dramatically from traditional Japanese military doctrine. Rather than launching suicidal banzai charges that would waste lives in dramatic but ultimately futile gestures, his troops were instructed to remain hidden, conserve ammunition, and make every shot count. Each soldier was expected to kill 10 Americans before dying himself, a grim arithmetic that reflected the hopeless mathematics of Japan's strategic situation. Buddhist and Shinto ceremonies provided spiritual preparation for what everyone understood would be their final battle. Chaplains moved through the caves conducting purification rituals and helping soldiers prepare their spirits for death in service to the emperor. Letters to families were written and stored with personal effects that would never be recovered. Intelligence reports indicated that American forces were preparing an invasion of unprecedented scale. Aerial reconnaissance revealed massive fleet formations assembling at bases throughout the Pacific, and radio intercepts suggested that the assault would begin in early 1945. The defenders had no illusions about the outcome. Their role was simply to ensure that the price paid for Iwo Jima would be so terrible that American leaders might reconsider their strategic objectives. According to declassified Japanese military documents housed in the War Ministry archives, the defensive preparations on Iwo Jima represented the most sophisticated underground fortification system ever constructed in the Pacific theater. The engineering effort had transformed a small volcanic island into a fortress that existed primarily below ground level, where traditional bombardment methods would prove largely ineffective. As winter approached, the final preparations were completed. Artillery pieces were zeroed on landing beaches, machine gun positions were camouflaged, and tunnel systems were sealed and tested. The garrison settled into their underground world, waiting for an enemy whose capabilities they understood intellectually, but whose weapons they had never encountered. The fortress was ready, but the defenders had prepared for a conventional battle using conventional weapons. None of their preparations had anticipated the mechanical dragons that would soon project streams of liquid fire deep into their carefully constructed underground world. February 19th, 1945, dawn broke over Iwo Jima as the largest naval bombardment in Pacific history reached its crescendo. For 74 consecutive days, American ships had pounded the 8-square-mile island, with shells ranging from 5-inch destroyer rounds to the massive 16-inch projectiles fired by battleships Iowa and Missouri. Yet as the bombardment lifted and the first assault waves approached the Black Beaches, Japanese defenders emerged from their underground fortress as if awakening from a long sleep. Corporal Tommy Nakamura of the 4th Marine Division crouched in his landing craft, watching the volcanic island grow larger through the morning haze. The 21-year-old from Los Angeles, D joined the Marines 2 days after Pearl Harbor, driven by a fury that his own Japanese ancestry made even more complex. He carried extra ammunition for his Browning automatic rifle and a grim determination to prove his loyalty in the most definitive way possible. The beaches initially seemed almost deserted. Marines landed with surprisingly light opposition, leading some to believe had the prolonged bombardment had been more effective than anticipated. However, As the assault forces moved inland toward the first airfield, the volcanic rock suddenly erupted with gunfire from positions that had been invisible moments before. Sergeant Michael Kowalski watched through his binoculars as Marines began falling to invisible enemies firing from caves that seemed to appear and disappear like deadly magic tricks. The 42-year-old tank commander from Pittsburgh had fought in North Africa and Sicily, but the enemy he faced on Iwo Jima was unlike anything in his previous experience. These weren't troops who could be flanked or outmaneuvered. They were embedded in the island itself, like deadly tumors. Inside Cave Complex Bravo 3, Japanese Corporal Akira Sato adjusted the sights on his Type 96 machine gun and waited for the American infantry to advance within effective range. The 19-year-old from rural Kyushu had spent 4 months in these tunnels, learning every angle and firing position until he could navigate them blindfolded. His orders were clear: remain hidden until targets presented themselves, then kill as many as possible before withdrawing through the tunnel system to another position. The conventional assault quickly bogged down as Marines discovered that traditional infantry tactics were useless against an enemy that could appear, fire, and disappear without exposing themselves to return fire. Artillery proved ineffective against positions buried 30 feet underground, and airstrikes could only scratch the surface of fortifications that extended deep into the volcanic core. It was shortly after 1000 hours when the first Zippo tanks rumbled onto the beach. Technical Sergeant James Murphy watched his mechanical monster climb the volcanic sand with a mixture of pride and apprehension. The flame tank weighed 35 tons and carried enough napalm to project fire for distances that would have been considered impossible just 2 years earlier. His crew had trained for months with this weapon, but they were about to test it against an enemy fortress that represented the ultimate challenge for their technological innovation. The first deployment targeted Cave System Alpha 5, which had been engaging Marines with machine gun fire for over an hour. Murphy positioned his tank at maximum effective range, approximately 350 feet from the cave mouth, and called for his gunner to prepare the flame projector. The psychological impact on both sides was immediate and profound. As reported in Stars and Stripes military newspaper coverage from February 20, 1945, the first use of flamethrower tanks on Iwo Jima created effects that exceeded even the most optimistic predictions of their designers. The streams of liquid fire not only neutralized enemy positions, but created a psychological shock that reverberated throughout the Japanese defensive network. Inside the targeted cave, Corporal Sato felt the temperature spike dramatically as orange flame filled the tunnel system, like a living creature seeking prey. The napalm mixture stuck to rock surfaces and burned with an intensity that consumed oxygen faster than human lungs could process it. Within 30 seconds, positions that had seemed impregnable became uninhabitable furnaces that forced defenders to choose between burning alive or abandoning positions they had sworn to hold until death. The transformation in tactical effectiveness was immediate and decisive. Positions that had withstood days of conventional bombardment fell silent within minutes of flame attack, and Japanese commanders quickly realized they faced a weapon for which their defensive preparations were completely inadequate. February 21, 1945, 48 hours into the battle, Captain Harrison Blake crouched behind his Zippo tank and studied the volcanic ridge that had defied 3 separate infantry assaults. The 28-year-old officer from Montana had commanded conventional Sherman tanks through the campaigns in Normandy and the Bulge, but nothing in his European experience had prepared him for the unique challenges of cave warfare in the Pacific. His tank, nicknamed Prairie Fire by its crew, had already neutralized 7 cave systems during its first 2 days of combat. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was becoming evident as positions that had previously fought to the last man were being abandoned after just preliminary flame attacks. However, Blake was also discovering the tactical limitations of his weapon. Flamethrower tanks were devastatingly effective against fixed positions, but vulnerable to mobile counterattacks. Inside Cave Complex Charlie 7, Japanese Lieutenant Kenji Watanabe gathered his remaining squad around a map drawn on volcanic rock. The 26-year-old engineering officer had spent the past month studying the American flame attacks, trying to understand their capabilities and develop countermeasures. His observations were troubling. The liquid fire could penetrate deeper into tunnel systems than anyone had anticipated, and the oxygen consumption made even distant chambers uninhabitable within minutes. Watanabe's innovation came from understanding the flamethrower's fundamental weakness. The weapon required time to deploy, aim, and fire, during which the tank was stationary and vulnerable. His solution involved coordinated attacks using satchel charges and magnetic mines carried by volunteers, willing to sacrifice their lives to destroy the mechanical dragons that were systematically dismantling their defensive network. The first counterattack came at 14:30 hours when Private First Class Hiroaki Yamada emerged from a spider hole 50 feet behind Blake's tank and sprinted toward the vehicle carrying a 20-pound satchel charge. The 20-year-old from Hiroshima had volunteered for what everyone understood was a suicide mission, driven by desperation and the sight of his comrades being burned alive in positions they had sworn to defend. Corporal Eddie Martinez, serving as Blake's tank commander, spotted the running figure through his periscope and traversed the main gun toward the threat. However, the flamethrower system required several seconds to rotate and aim, precious time during which Yamada covered most of the distance to his target. The satchel charge explosion rocked the 35-ton tank but failed to penetrate its armor, though the blast damaged the flame projector's hydraulic systems. The engagement illustrated the deadly chess match developing between American technology and Japanese desperation. Each successful flame attack prompted tactical adaptations from defenders who had nothing left to lose, while American crews learned to coordinate their operations with infantry support that could protect them during vulnerable deployment phases. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, operating the tank's radio, coordinated with forward observers who identified priority targets throughout the cave network. The systematic approach to cave clearing represented a new form of warfare that combined industrial-level firepower with precision targeting. Each cave system required individual assessment to determine the optimal angle and duration of flame attack needed to neutralize defenders without wasting the precious napalm mixture. According to after-action reports filed with the 3rd Marine Division headquarters, the effectiveness of flamethrower tanks increased dramatically when they operated as part of combined arms teams that include conventional armor, infantry, and engineers. The flame tanks provided the capability to neutralize fortified positions, while supporting elements protected them from counterattack and exploited the gaps created by successful flame operations. The psychological warfare aspect proved as important as the physical destruction. Japanese radio intercepts revealed increasing discussions of evacuation and withdrawal among units that had previously declared their intention to fight to the death. The prospect of being burned alive in Yunnan underground chambers created a form of terror that differed qualitatively from the fear generated by conventional weapons. By sunset, on February 21st, American forces had advanced further inland than planners had expected for the first week of combat. The breakthrough came not from superior numbers or better tactics, but from a weapon that transformed the fundamental nature of cave warfare. Positions that could have held out for weeks against conventional assault were being neutralized in minutes by streams of liquid fire that made underground fortifications into death traps rather than protective shelters. The volcanic fortress that had taken months to construct was being systematically dismantled by mechanical dragons, whose breath could reach into the deepest chambers and transform them into furnaces no human could survive. February 23, 1945. Deep within the central command bunker of Mount Suribachi, General Kuribayashi studied reports that confirmed his worst fears about American flamethrower capabilities. The 60-foot-deep command post, carved from solid volcanic rock and reinforced with steel plating, had seemed impregnable just days earlier. Now, as streams of liquid fire reached deeper into cave systems than anyone had thought possible, even this ultimate sanctuary felt vulnerable. Major Yoshida Sakai, Kuribayashi's intelligence officer, spread reconnaissance photographs across the rough-hewn table that served as their planning center. The images, captured by observers who had risked their lives to study American flame operations, revealed technical details that made their situation even more desperate than previously understood. The American tanks could project fire over 400 feet horizontally and adjust their aim to follow tunnel curves, filling chambers that seemed beyond their reach. The flame mixture adheres to surfaces and continues burning for up to 10 minutes, Sakai reported in a voice barely above a whisper. Oxygen levels in affected chambers drop to levels that cause unconsciousness within 30 seconds. Even positions connected to the main ventilation system become uninhabitable when the fire consumes available air supplies. Kuribayashi nodded grimly as he absorbed information that rendered months of defensive preparation obsolete. His engineers had designed the cave systems to withstand bombardment by the largest naval guns, but they had never anticipated weapons that could project liquid fire deep into underground chambers. The careful ventilation systems that were supposed to keep defenders alive during prolonged sieges had become highways for flame that could reach positions hundreds of feet from the original point of attack. Above ground, Sergeant First Class Anthony Rossi maneuvered his Zippo tank into position for an attack on Cave Complex Delta II, which intelligence reports indicated served as a regional command center for Japanese defensive operations. The 31-year-old from Brooklyn had been operating flamethrower tanks for 6 months, but each engagement taught him new lessons about the weapon's capabilities and limitations. His crew had developed techniques that weren't covered in any training manual. Gunner Corporal William Thompson had learned to walk the flame stream through tunnel openings by adjusting elevation and traverse during firing, following the contours of underground passages, like a deadly river seeking the lowest ground. Radio operator Private James Kim coordinated with reconnaissance teams that used listening devices to detect movement in chambers that appeared to be neutralized. The attack on Delta II began at 1100 hours, with a preliminary flame burst, designed to test the cave system's configuration. Thompson aimed the projector at the main entrance and fired a 3-second stream that illuminated the darkness beyond the opening with hellish orange light. The napalm mixture flowed down the entry tunnel like molten lava, revealing secondary passages that branched off from the main chamber. Inside the targeted complex, Japanese Captain Hiroshi Ando felt the temperature spike as flame filled the outer chambers. The 35-year-old career officer had commanded artillery positions throughout the Pacific Campaign, but nothing had prepared him for the sensation of being trapped underground while liquid fire consumed the oxygen that sustained life. His men pressed deeper into the tunnel system, sealing blast doors behind them as they retreated from chambers that had become furnaces. The systematic clearing of the cave network took 4 hours of coordinated flame attacks. Rossi's tank worked methodically through the complex, projecting fire into each chamber and passage until thermal sensors indicated that all areas had reached temperatures incompatible with human survival. The process consumed over 200 gallons of napalm mixture, but it neutralized a command center that could have coordinated defensive operations for weeks. Intelligence documents recovered after the war, housed in the Japanese Defense Agency archives, revealed that flame attacks caused a psychological collapse among defenders that exceeded their physical effectees. Units that had prepared for heroic last stands found themselves facing a form of death that contradicted every cultural and military tradition that had shaped their understanding of honorable combat. The success at Delta II established patterns that would be repeated throughout the remaining battle for Iwo Jima. Cave systems that had taken months to construct were being neutralized in hours by weapons. It transformed underground fortifications from protective shelters into death traps. The volcanic rock that had seemed like an impregnable shield had become a prison that trapped defenders while liquid fire consumed the air they needed to survive. By evening, American forces had advanced to positions that were not expected to be reached for another week. The breakthrough came not from conventional tactics, but from a technological innovation that changed the fundamental nature of underground warfare. The mechanical dragons had proven capable of reaching into the deepest chambers of the volcanic fortress and transforming them into furnaces that no human courage could withstand. March 2nd, 1945, 11 days into the battle that was supposed to last 3 days, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb stood atop Mount Suribachi and surveyed a landscape that resembled the surface of an alien planet. The volcanic rock had been scarred by thousands of flame attacks that had left black streaks radiating from cave openings, like the tentacles of some massive underground creature. His Zippo tanks had transformed Iwo Jima into a testament to the terrible efficiency of industrial warfare, applied to the intimate brutality of cave fighting. The flag-raising ceremony had taken place just hours earlier, But Webb knew that the symbolic victory meant little while thousands of Japanese defenders remained hidden in the underground fortress that honeycombed the island's interior. His flamethrower tanks had neutralized over 300 cave systems, but intelligence reports indicated that major defensive positions still operated in the island's central highlands. Technical Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, one of the few female mechanics authorized to work on classified weapon systems, supervised the maintenance of flame projectors that had been pushed beyond their design specifications. The 24-year-old from New Mexico had discovered that the intense heat generated by continuous firing caused metallurgical changes in the projector nozzles that affected range and accuracy. Her innovations in field maintenance had kept the Zippo tanks operational when factory-designed procedures proved inadequate for combat conditions. "The projector systems are wearing out faster than anticipated," she reported to Webb during the evening briefing. "We're getting flame streams that curve unexpectedly due to nozzle deformation, and the range has decreased by approximately 15% from original specifications. However, I've developed field modifications that should restore most of the lost performance." Inside Cave System Echo 1, the deepest and most elaborate defensive position remaining on the island, Japanese Colonel Masuo Ikeda prepared his final message to Imperial Headquarters. The 50-year-old career officer had commanded the 27th Infantry Regiment through 3 years of Pacific combat, but he understood that his military career would end in the volcanic tunnels beneath his feet. The cave system extended over 200 feet underground, through multiple levels connected by narrow passages that had been designed to channel attackers into killing zones. However, the American flame weapons had rendered these defensive advantages meaningless by transforming the carefully engineered passages into conduits for liquid fire that could reach chambers that had seemed beyond any conceivable threat. "The enemy flame attacks exceed all previous intelligence estimates," Ikeda wrote in his final report. "Defensive positions that were calculated to withstand siege conditions for 30 days are being neutralized in 30 minutes. The weapon creates conditions that make heroic resistance impossible. Our soldiers are not dying in glorious combat, but being suffocated in chambers that have become furnaces." The assault on Echo 1 began at dawn on March 3rd, with the largest concentration of Zippo tanks deployed in a single operation. Webb had assembled 8 flamethrower tanks in a coordinated attack that WW had systematically worked through the cave network from multiple directions simultaneously. The goal was to create overlapping flame coverage that would make retreat impossible while ensuring that no chamber could serve as a refuge. Sergeant First Class David Park commanded the lead tank in the assault formation. The Korean-American soldier from Los Angeles had volunteered for flamethrower duty after losing 2 brothers in previous Pacific camp, Ains, and he approached each mission with a methodical intensity that impressed his crews. His tank, Soul Fire, had participated in more cave clearing operations than any other vehicle in the unit. The coordinated attack created effects that exceeded even Webb's expectations. 8 streams of liquid fire converged on the cave system from different angles, filling chambers and passages with overlapping CICM overage that eliminated any possibility of survival. The napalm mixture flowed through the tunnel network like a tide of liquid destruction, seeking every chamber and crevice where defenders might have sought shelter. According to post-battle engineering surveys conducted by the Army Corps of Engineers, the Echo 1 cave system reached temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit during the flame attack. The volcanic rock itself began to fracture from thermal stress, and metal equipment inside the chambers melted into pools of slag that provided mute testimony to the intensity of the inferno that had consumed the position. The systematic destruction of Echo 1 marked the end of organized Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima. Isolated pockets of defenders continued fighting from individual caves and spider holes, but the coordinated defensive network that had made the island such a formidable fortress had been dismantled by weapons that transformed underground fortifications from assets into liabilities. The battle for Iwo Jima officially ended on March 26, 1945, after 36 days of combat that had cost over 28,000 American casualties. However, the tactical revolution represented by the Zippo tanks had implications that extended far beyond a single volcanic island in the Pacific Ocean. March 26, 1945. As the last Japanese resistance ended on Iwo Jima, General Curtis LeMay studied classified reports that would influence American military planning for the invasion of Japa in itself. The 60-year-old commander of the 21st Bomber Command had built his reputation on the strategic bombing campaign that was systematically destroying Japanese cities, but the tactical lessons from Iwo Jima suggested that ground operations against the Japanese home islands would require weapons that could neutralize underground fortifications on an unprecedented scale. The statistical analysis painted a stark picture of flamethrower effectiveness. Zippo tanks had neutralized over 800 cave systems during the 36-day battle, averaging less than 30 minutes per position compared to the hours or days required for conventional assault methods. More significantly, positions attacked by flamethrowers showed abandonment rates of over 80%, indicating that the psychological impact exceeded the physical destruction. Captain Jennifer Walsh, one of the first women authorized to analyze classified weapons effectiveness data, compiled reports that would shape military doctrine for decades. Her analysis revealed that flamethrower tanks had achieved tactical effects with significantly lower ammunition expenditure than conventional weapons. A single Zippo tank carrying 750 gallons of napalm mixture could neutralize cave systems that would have required thousands of artillery shells or hundreds of airstrikes using traditional methods. The implications for Operation Downfall are profound, Walsh reported in her classified assessment. Japanese defensive preparations on Kyushu and Honshu include cave systems that dwarf anything we encountered on Iwo Jima. However, our flamethrower tactics have demonstrated that underground fortifications can be transformed from defensive assets into death traps that force enemy abandonment, rather than requiring direct assault. Meanwhile, in the ruins of Tokyo, Japanese military planners struggled to develop countermeasures for weapons that had rendered their defensive philosophy obsolete. Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto, serving on the Army General Staff, analyzed reports from Iwo Jima that revealed the complete failure of tactics that had been successful against conventional weapons throughout the Pacific Campaign. The Japanese had based their homeland defense strategy on the assumption that American forces would be forced to assault prepared positions using infantry and conventional armor. Cave systems, underground bunkers, and tunnel networks were designed to channel attackers into killing zones where superior Japanese knowledge of terrain would offset American advantages in firepower and logistics. However, the flamethrower tanks had demonstrated that these defensive preparations could be neutralized without direct assault. The American flame weapons have fundamentally altered the tactical balance, Yamamoto reported to his superiors. Our defensive preparations, which required months of engineering effort and thousands of man-hours to construct, can be neutralized in minutes by weapons that require no precision aiming or coordination with supporting elements. The psychological impact on our troops exceeds the physical destruction, as soldiers trained for heroic resistance find themselves facing a form of death that provides no opportunity for honorable combat. Technical Sergeant Robert Hayes, who had operated Zippo tanks throughout the Iwo Jima campaign, was selected for the team planning flamethrower operations during the proposed invasion of Japan. The 32-year-old from Ohio had personally neutralized over 40 cave systems and developed tactical innovations that were being incorporated into training programs for crews that would participate in Operation Downfall. His recommendations emphasized the psychological dimensions of flamethrower warfare that had emerged during the Iwo Jima fighting. The weapon's effectiveness comes not just from its ability to kill enemy soldiers, Hayes wrote in his tactical assessment, but from its capacity to create conditions that make resistance psychologically impossible. Soldiers who are prepared to die in combat are not prepared to be suffocated in underground chambers while liquid fire consumes the air they need to survive. The development of improved flamethrower systems accelerated through the spring and summer of 1945, as American forces prepared for operations that would dwarf the Iwo Jima assault. New T-ANC designs incorporated lessons learned from Pacific combat, including improved range, better crew protection, and increased napalm capacity that would allow sustained operations against the extensive cave networks that intelligence reports indicated throughout the Japanese home islands. However, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 eliminated the need for Operation Downfall, ending the war before the tactical innovations developed on Iwo Jima could be tested on their ultimate scale. The Zippo tanks had proven their effectiveness in the laboratory of volcanic caves and underground fortresses, but their most significant impact would be felt in post-war military doctrine rather than continued Pacific combat. As documented in declassified Pentagon planning documents from 1946, the flamethrower tactics developed during the Iwo Jima campaign influenced American military thinking for decades. The weapons that had earned the nickname Zippo tanks from their resemblance to cigarette lighters had demonstrated that technological innovation could transform the fundamental nature of warfare, making defensive preparations obsolete and forcing tactical adaptations that neither side had anticipated when the battle began. The legacy of those streams of liquid fire that had reached 400 feet into volcanic caves would extend far beyond the black beaches of a small island in the Pacific Ocean, shaping military doctrine and weapons development throughout the Cold War era that followed.